So thank you for inviting me. It was a really good occasion to begin to think more sociologically about generative AI. So it's interesting you put that in the introduction, Roger, because I still do see myself as a digital sociologist, but I've also worked in education departments for the last 6 years now. And that's not just doing digital sociology in education, it's also a very applied strand of my work, which sometimes doesn't feel like digital sociology, which is working with academics, university policymakers, training providers, learning technologists about how academics use digital technology. And it's in that context that I've originally approached generative AI, and I've been working on a project to develop a training book for academics, which I've almost finished. And the connection between the applied strand of my work and the more theoretical sociological strand is one that is very key to how I approach these topics. And this is an opportunity to begin to pivot into the sociological side of these issues. But before I do that, I mean, it can be helpful just to offer a definition. This is possibly a contested definition, but I would tend to think of generative AI as a broad category of software and services, effectively, some consumer facing, some business to business. And what they share is the capacity to generate cultural material in response to natural language prompts. So public attention for this is almost entirely a matter of ChatGPT, launched by OpenAI in November 2022. And in a way, I feel sorry for every other firm and developer working on this, because it's quite a rich and varied landscape, built upon an underlying technology of large language models alongside other technologies like transformer architectures. And there's an enormous range of things being done within a sector that is attracting investment as the next big thing, effectively. It's a new hype wave. And what I want to do is to understand that hype wave sociologically, to understand the political economy of it, to understand where it might go and how it fits into broader sets of societal transformations. But also to recognize that in contrast to NFT, in contrast to Web3, I think there is a radical technological development here as well. It is a hype wave, but it's also simultaneously something with real and likely enduring consequences. But it's important to say at the outset that this isn't artificial general intelligence, nor is it going to become so. These systems aren't intelligent. They're also not really autonomous. They're more like autocomplete on a vast scale. And some of the underlying methodology of this work is, in a sense, not new. It's the scale at which that methodology can be applied. So there are roots behind large language models in corpus linguistics and approaches that have been around for at least 10 years. It's simply the scale at which the training and computation can be done that has changed. But as I've said, these chatbots, which is a term I don't like, I tend to prefer conversational agents, are only part of the generative AI landscape. These are some examples of other forms of generative AI with immediate and practical uses. This is a graphic I produced in DALL-E 3, which is now embedded in ChatGPT. You might notice that it's not spelled very well or even coherently at all. And this is an interesting limitation on image generators. So I put this list of bullet points into DALL-E and asked it for a representation. And graphically, I think it conveyed what I wanted very effectively. It simply struggles with language, as you can see from paraphrasing engine and drafting presenter. And so I'm still trying to understand what the technological basis for this difficulty with language is. But I almost dismissed this picture when I made it because obviously it's misspelled. But I thought it captured nicely the remarkable capabilities of these systems and the startling limitations they still have. The fact I could make that graphic in literally 30 seconds, I think, is remarkable. The fact the graphic is so flawed in spite of its visual sophistication is equally fascinating. And that to me is the duality. These systems can do astonishing things, but they're also brittle and they fail. They fail in sometimes predictable, but often unpredictable ways. But they're going to have a big impact on the world far beyond what they've already had. These are two images that circulated earlier on this year. I thought the left one might be true, whereas the right one was obviously fabricated. These were both produced with image generation software. And I think the Pope and the Puffer Jacket is an interesting example because the sense in which you think it could possibly be a real image conveys the liminal space in which we will be operating culturally increasingly, when the gap between what constitutes a real image and what is a fabricated image starts to break down simply because we can't easily discern between the two. The image on the right is one that circulated widely, I think, because there was a sense of people wanting to believe it was a real image. But, I found that more difficult to see something that could be real. There's a lot going on with this topic effectively. I'm getting to the end of a 90,000 word book about generative AI, and I feel like I barely scratched the surface of it. So I wanted to acknowledge the things that I won't talk about today, such as the epistemic limitations. These systems have a tendency towards what's called hallucination. They are prone to making statistically plausible but factually incorrect claims. And you can mitigate this problem in the design, but it's inherent in the apparatus of inference. There's a real set of issues which are increasingly prominent about the environmental impact. Some scholars suggest that the water consumption issue is overstated, but it seems to me that the energy use issue is real. These are computationally intensive processes. And often we are taking something that was previously done locally and inserting a remote computationally intensive intermediary. So it's just the mechanism for making existing processes use far more energy than they did previously. There are vast institutional challenges of generative AI about data governance, about ownership of the intellectual property. There's a lot of issues surrounding technology underpinning GAI and the politics of it, which I do touch on later, but particularly the kind of extractive dimension where these systems are trained on publicly available cultural outputs, and they're being used to generate services, commercial services, that risk making the financial viability of people, of the work, of the jobs producing those outputs even more tenuous than it already is. And so, as I said, I've started from the perspective of guiding academics in how to use these systems reflectively. I've occasionally worried that I'm simply taking the coming ubiquity of generative AI as a given, but I find myself increasingly frustrated by critical approaches to generative AI that, for example, are prone to pointing out as a hype cycle, as if making that observation will in itself deflate the diffusion of this technology. And so I am interested in how we build user cultures around generative AI, how we develop norms and frameworks to ensure that we will at least tend to use these systems in reflective ways, because I think part of the problem is if they're used in unreflective, instrumental ways. And within higher education, I think that could be disastrous. And so I came to this to my surprise, really. I'm usually a messy and exploratory writer, and I usually have to write a lot to find out what I'm trying to say. And the idea for this book just popped fully formed into my head one day earlier on this year, that I'd written 2 editions of the Social Media for Academics book. And it just occurred to me, generative AI for academics, and a structure, topics all came to mind. And I'm getting to the end of that now, which is why I'm so keen to try and put it in a wider sociological perspective. And I'm going to suggest 5 topics here, which I'm trying to explore. And this is very early on, but my intuition throughout has been that something very significant is happening about the relationship between technology and capitalism here. And this is my attempt to begin to unpick those intuitions and cash them out as concrete claims. The first is how the rise of generative AI as a suite of tools and services is linked to the dominance of big tech firms. Without the concentration of capital, the quantity of data, as well as the data infrastructures and analytical expertise these firms had accumulated, I don't think generative AI could have emerged at all, let alone in the form that it has. And so even if there are a lot of small players who have rapidly become influential startups working in this field, actually, I think it's anchored in the tech giants, and understanding the nature of that dependence is very important. And in part, this is a trend we've seen before, where the availability of capital in tech enables effectively loss-leading ventures. So firms can prioritize long-term strategic value and growth over immediate profitability. But what's interesting is that prior to generative AI, that set of economic conditions had begun to break down, and it's been reinstated with this particular technology. And it's also connected to the past hype wave. I don't know if anyone's been following Sam Bankman-Fried, the kind of crypto billionaire who's now in prison and is going to trial soon. But once you start looking, you can see the kind of the past hype wave of crypto has its tentacles into the funding of generative AI. So there's a firm called Anthropic, which run the chatbot Claude, which I actually prefer to ChatGPT. They frame themselves as an AI safety and research company. They frame themselves as the ethical alternative to OpenAI. And Sam Bankman-Fried invested $500 million in them. And so part of the project that I want to do, I think, is tracing out these connections between past hype waves and the present hype wave of generative AI, as well as trying to understand the broader interdependence at the level of political economy. The second is the political economy of the hype itself, or I guess the cultural political economy. So one of the reasons why I've tried to link social media to generative AI in this sense is that I think generative AI has been dependent on social media. It's been dependent on social media firms and the concentration of capital within them. But culturally, it's also been dependent upon social media. Social media platforms have been an ideal mechanism for amplifying hype and accelerating the spread of tech narratives. And so I've tried to think about this at the micro, meso, and macro levels. In terms of investors and tech evangelists, these platforms are a way of drumming enthusiasm, because if you're an early investor, you have a vested interest in growing the hype around your investment, because that's how you ensure a large return over time. But organizations are caught up in this dynamic as well. We've seen this with big data, as it was then called. The idea that data is the new oil, you will adapt or be left behind. This is a brave new world. You need to understand how to use this resource within your organization, or your competitors will push you out. And we're seeing that now as well. And also individual users are caught up in the spectacle which they share through social media. One of the things that I think has not been adequately studied is the extent to which ChatGPT 3.5 was one of the most successful viral marketing campaigns in human history. The way in which users were doing the work of promoting this by endlessly sharing screenshots of the puns, the poems, the songs, the jokes it was producing, I think that played a huge part in driving this as a spectacle. And so we can see hype emerging and to a certain extent being orchestrated at multiple levels. And this collective momentum can sway perceptions and drive more rapid adoption that would otherwise occur. And we're in an interesting phase now, because I think that micro, meso, macro hype wave is coming apart. The individual hype wave is slowing on multiple measures. For example, there's a lack of growth in ChatGPT subscriptions. Since Microsoft incorporated GPT into Bing, it's had little discernible impact on the use of Bing, but Microsoft has been running Bing at a loss, at a multi-billion-dollar loss for years, so I don't think they really mind. And so this individual height wave is slowing, in part, I think, because we're seeing a split between people who've worked out how to use this as part of their working life and those who haven't. And because organizations have been hesitant to encourage this use up till now, it's been an individualized matter over who's an early adopter, who's persisted and explored, and who hasn't. And so the individual engagement, I think the momentum is dissipating now, but the organizational and the macroeconomic height wave is proceeding. A third interdependence between social media and generative AI is user-generated content. So these models are trained on lots of content, vast troves of data. But this includes, crucially, user-generated content that is available online. I think it's important to be clear that, to the best of my knowledge, this is not to say that, say, Facebook or YouTube, TikTok, these models are not trained on the data from the large-scale social media platforms, as far as I'm aware. Actually, the training data is much more reliant on smaller creator-based social media platforms. So, for example, DeviantArt for artists and Omegaverse for fan fiction. And so the politics, I think, given the techlash of the last 5 or 6 years, mean that the large social media platforms are, I think, reticent to make their user data accessible for training in this way. If we think of Google, for example, Gmail, I think over 1 billion people, if I remember correctly, internationally use Gmail. That would be an astonishing resource for training data for generative AI systems. But last time I saw, they said that's not going to be used. And so there's a political restraint on the larger platforms doing this, but the smaller ones have done it in quite have allowed it to happen, because in many cases this is not their direct imperative. The data simply been scraped. And there are huge diversity issues here. So, for example, Reddit features prominently in the GPT training data, as does Wikipedia. Wikipedia, I could not be more enthusiastic, but we do know that the Wikipedia community of editors is relatively small and skews Anglophone and I think American, if I remember the data correctly. Reddit, I think, skews Anglophone, American, and angry and male in some parts. And so these data sets have biases and are structured in a way that reflects the existing social context. And the model is learning from those in a way that is inevitably marked by and constrained by those limitations. And it's then acting in the world and influencing the world in a way that often is not accountable to its limitations. So there's a complex interdependence there between generative AI and social media. The one that is most closely tied to the book project is public pedagogy. So this is a term from Jean Burgess and Nancy Bames' brilliant book on Twitter. And they use it to refer to how one of the things social media users reliably do is talk to each other about how to use social media. And particularly in the early stages of a platform, this can play a crucial role in establishing norms and standards, in supporting other users, newer users, and almost socializing people into the role of the user in the platform. And in doing so, these communities collaboratively shape the understanding and best practices. I really like Burgess and Bames' approach to this because they stress the extent to which users almost co-create platforms, whereas a lot of the sociological literature on platforms is very bad at treating agency as a kind of vector of change, which is not to say that the agents, the users, make the platform. Clearly they don't. But I think it's important to recognize that we're not just determined by platforms, we also exercise an influence over them. And so this is very important for generative AI because the versatility of tools like ChatGPT and Claude are a strength, but also a challenge. In a very real sense, OpenAI still don't know everything that ChatGPT can do. because it can do so many things. It's a general purpose tool in a way that we have still not fully mapped out. And so they're quite explicit, actually, albeit in euphemistic ways, about having thrown this out into the world in order to see what users make of it so they can learn from the experience. This means there's not a single playbook. I mean, there's not really, in a straightforward sense, an instruction manual for ChatGPT. And public pedagogy through social media has an important role to play in socializing users into responsible use of generative AI. The problem is that the social media landscape in 2023 is so utterly cursed that it brings about quite negative trends here. So we see AI influencers propounding how to get rich quick, often using AI-generated content in the process. We see very polarized debates about AI that implicitly make suggestions about how users should act, but are not geared towards actually guiding users concretely. And I think if this had come along earlier, there would have been potential for a much more constructive public pedagogy, which is there in parts, but my claim is that structurally, social media is being relied upon as a forum for pedagogy about generative AI. But simultaneously, culturally, it's at a point in its evolution where it is not well equipped to play that role in a constructive and supportive way. And so the timing here, I think, is very unfortunate. And the final point I want to make is about digital advertising. So Evgeny Morozov argued as far ago as 2017 that we could see an obvious trend for the big tech firms, those of them who are reliant on digital advertising, which is not all of them by any means. They've wanted to diversify because they recognized a saturation point that is coming, and there are vulnerabilities in the model. And so I'd suggest generative AI is being seized upon as a pivot away from ad-centric revenue streams, particularly after the pandemic, because it's interesting to note that just a year ago, over a year ago, the large tech firms were in crisis, and the sector as a whole was seeing a crisis it hadn't seen since the dot-com crash. And this was in large part, I think, macroeconomic. As interest rates rose, investors were no longer willing to sacrifice short-term profitability for long-term market dominance. And as inflation rose around the world, we saw downturns in consumer spending, concurrent downturns in advertising budgets, and in general, a investment climate, particularly after the financial crash in 07-08, which was very hospitable towards the growth of big tech, became something very inhospitable. And generative AI has emerged at exactly the point where there's an impossibility for a new set of parameters for platformized accumulation of capital. And this is where it's barely a work in progress. These are just some speculative thoughts at this stage in my argument. But I'm interested in whether this can be understood as a form of accumulation by dispossession in Harvey's sense, that these training models are publicly available and are trained on publicly available text and imagery. And they're used to develop systems which render the occupations of producing that text and imagery even more economically difficult than they currently are. I'm interested in understanding historically how social media and generative AI interconnect institutionally, technologically, and socioculturally. And through that historicization, I'd like to understand what's happening with what Nick Cernacek calls platform capitalism. Because I keep coming back to the situation in the sector a year to a year and a half ago. There were layoffs, the stock price was tanking, investors were starting to assert themselves in relation to short-term profitability. You know, Google in its history has never been constrained by its investors, for example, in a way that other firms in other sectors would be. And that was starting to happen. And, you know, we also have the spectacle of Musk taking over Twitter and everything that expresses and has also led to, which is something that I've talked and written about a lot over the last year. And so we've seen a huge growth in unicorns, firms with a valuation of over $1 billion. All of these firms are new. Well, not all new, actually, new to varying degrees. And so it can seem like this is a vast set of new entrants to a marketplace who are staking out innovative terrain and doing capitalism well. But actually, this is an ecosystem that is still dominated by the big players. And I think we're going to see further waves of consolidation and acquisition, which buy up these firms. So, for example, Amazon have now made a huge investment in Anthropic because they need to get in on the generative AI game in the way that Microsoft did early. And so the economic landscape of generative AI, I think, is very, very interesting. And the question that I'm plagued by increasingly, which takes me out of my intellectual comfort zone as someone who's primarily a social theorist and microsociologist, is what kind of economic formation are we moving into, assuming my intuition is correct, that there is a shift in formation. A couple of weeks ago, I read Yanis Varoufakis's new book about techno-feudalism, where he argues we've moved into a new system in which platformized strategies of extraction and rentership have replaced profit-orientated exploitation in the workplace. And he's not suggesting this is a uniform development, but he's drawing an analogy to how capitalism develops alongside the remnants of legacy feudalism. And so much as for Marx and Engels, it was useful to talk about capitalism as a new set of economic arrangements emerging within the old, so too is it useful to label this as something new taking place and developing amongst contemporary capitalism. But my instinct is that this isn't quite right, that the mode of platform capitalism, and I think Cernicek's book in 2016, 2017, was very astute, but very partial. It was an attempt to historicize the emergence of the platform as a socioeconomic model and to outline its key features. And I wonder now if we are seeing its mature form taking shape, driven in part by the macroeconomic transition that the pandemic led to. As someone who did a lot of work on in the university sector on how the pandemic was likely to change universities, I got very invested in the idea that the pandemic was an epochal event. It marked a transition. But it seems increasingly that the pandemic was a precursor to the economic crisis that was the epochal transition. And I'd like to understand what this transition is, if indeed the claim of a transition can be justified. And I think the transition from social media to generative AI is a useful socio-technical lens through which to explore these questions. Because something has shifted in social media as well. Musk embodies this, but he didn't create it. And we've seen a switch to a subscription-based model that is happening across the digital economy. And there was a friendly, supportive, and exciting demeanor to consumer-facing tech firms. With the tech clash, people started to see through this and to critique it and to act against it. But there was still the pretense that these were firms interested in facilitating the agency of users and making the lives of users better. It feels to me like that pretense is fading and these firms are becoming something else. And this could be something quite dark and quite worrying politically and democratically. And to understand the politics of the moment that we're in, we urgently have to understand the influence of the largest firms within the global economy. We have to understand the technology in relation to which their dominance is exercised, and we have to see this historically. And so this takes me quite far from where I started, which is how can academics use generative AI in reflective and effective ways. But I wanted to map out the connection between the issues, because the further I get into these issues of academic practice, when I trace out these connections, it does seem to lead to a whole set of questions that are fascinating, some of which I feel well equipped to analyze, others I feel out of my comfort zone with. But I hope this has been useful. I found it helpful to put all this together and to talk through it out loud for the first time. And I'd love to hear what you think and answer any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Mark, for a very perceptive and wide-ranging discussion about the political economy of social media and generative AI. Early on, you talked about the idea that generative AI was very much linked to and dependent upon social media. I wonder if you might just elaborate upon that a little bit, if you're able to.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot going on there. I mean, I guess in a way that's what the whole presentation was geared towards, and I'm just trying to map that out on different levels. Because in practical terms, it struck me early on that the problems academics face are quite similar to the problems of social media in many ways. So there are new things you can do with generative AI tools and services. There are the opportunities to do existing things in different ways. There is the question of whether you understand these systems you're using, how you can understand them better, the fact there aren't any kind of established norms and norms and standards. So at the level of agency, I think there is an interesting parallel. And so the other bit of my work, the project I've been working on since my PhD in 2014, and have been slowly plugging away at since then, is a theory of agency, which accounts for the capabilities digital technology facilitates but doesn't determine. So I'm coming at that from a critical realist perspective and arguing that particularly when you look over the life course, the parameters of our agency are determined, at least in part, by the technological arrangements we're bound up in. And so, I'm trying to move between different levels in a possibly not completely coherent way, but all these things are connected in my mind. It's just different bits of my working life. I talk about them in very different ways.
Another issue, and I'm sorry to bring this up, but it's sort of, and maybe you don't even want to comment on it, but there's been a moral panic about the use of AI, generative AI, by students and so forth, and what impact that will have on, in this case, for example, the university sector. Is that something that you kind of tackle as well?
Yeah, I mean, I've not been able to avoid it. I mean, it's yeah, I'm tired of talking about that at this stage. So I've talked about it a lot over the last year. There are real issues there. There are real and significant issues, but the debate has unfolded in an incredibly unhelpful way that has systematically got in the way of addressing the real issues. And so in the book, I write about this as a moral panic because I think it was a moral panic. And it's often preceded as if the assessment system was working effectively to begin with, and this is some new element that's come in and ruined something that was fine, and all we have to do is prop up the old system and we can go back to normal. And so I write in the book, for example, about contract cheating. I mean, we know the scale of the international contract cheating marketplace. It's just that this was formerly peripheral. Unless you were actively concerned with it, you didn't factor it into how you saw assessment. So my take is that the system was already breaking, and this has just accelerated that fragmentation, and that actually we needed to change it anyway. And so this is a spur towards more practice-based, more authentic, more creative assessment, and that we should have been doing that anyway, I think. So in that sense, I think it's fundamentally a good thing, but that we can't make that transition all in one go, and so there's a difficult work pivoting university-based assessment towards approaches that benefit from rather than are imperiled by generative AI. And that's a lot of what I'm doing day to day in my job at the moment, contributing to those discussions and debates.
Mm-hmm. Now, Ash Watson has made a comment. Ash, I wonder if you might like to speak to that comment that you make about mapping relationships.
Yes, I can. Hi, Mark. How you going? Thanks so much. It was a really, really interesting overview I suppose, where your thinking is going around this huge space that's opening up. As I said, it would be so great to hear a little bit more about your approach to kind of mapping this landscape and the relationships between these big players in some of the like very superficial compared to this work I've done around LLMs. You know, it's such a hard landscape to get a sense of in term, like a deep sense of, you know, the complexity of the relationships between these technologies and the actors in the space. So I'd love to hear more kind of how you're going about mapping this landscape in a real practical sense.
Yeah, thank you. Good to hear from you, by the way. It's been a long time. Yeah, like I've not honestly so far. So the kind of post training book project, this is about the summation of it. But it's something I've been thinking about. Like you know, I'd love to know more about what you're doing on this and to talk about it at some point. You know, I guess I've got two approaches in mind. One is possibly scraping databases of company registrations. I'm thinking about a project that I've seen a few people do of using Python to graph the relationship between firms in publicly available databases. And so, yeah, I think that could be interesting. But no, in all honesty, I've not really thought that far into it yet because it's still relatively new. Because I think it would have to be digital methods because these relationships are changing so rapidly. So
Thanks.
that's not
That sounds
a
amazing. No, I
yeah,
can see how there's a real potential there, especially around the like I don't know, the visualization of these connections could be like a really nice conceptually rich way to approach it. So yeah, that sounds great. And also we should definitely yeah, catch up again and talk about it in more detail. That'd be really nice.
Yes, it sounds good. And yeah, it occurs to me, I mean, Hugh Davis's work that he's done recently about different actors in kind of cultural war controversies is an interesting model of what this could look like. Because, you know, I'm interested in, I think in a way, I'm more interested in the kind of influencer networks and investor networks involved in this. And so, you know, kind of who is propounding which vision of this and how are they connected to each other. But no, thank you for that. That's got me thinking methodologically to a degree I haven't been previously.
I'm not sure if you've seen it, Roger. There's a question in here from Alistair about asking you, Mark, whether you think there's any positives that could come out of this in regards to democracy.
No, would be my answer really. I'm very pessimistic. Like in terms, I mean, democracy in a kind of a broadest sense, yes. I think one of the most exciting things about this technology is its capacity for inclusion. I think there's an enormous contribution generative AI will make to accessibility, possibly, hopefully, across all areas of society. In terms of democracy in a kind of stricter political participatory sense, I honestly think it will be an absolute disaster. And I am very worried about the next US election. I mean, there's a whole series of consequential elections taking place around the world over the next 2 or 3 years. And we've already seen AI-driven misinformation start to play a role. And so, you know, a fake video comes out, the politician says, no, that's fake. But it sows the seed of doubt. And it's very hard for people to unsee something that's circulated that way. I think politically we've entered into quite a dark new place, and we're likely to see arms races effectively.
Do you think this feeds into, or how do you think it feeds into the, if you like, the sort of elite theory of control in terms of yeah, sort of political control of the, you know, if the, without trying to sound too conspiratorial, which makes me sound like an AI generated bot, you know, in that sense of it being that there is an elite which draws most of the wealth, most of the influence out of the system, and how do you think that plays out theoretically in terms of contributing towards that? And then do you think there's a way of actually countering that in the sense of, one talks about social activism and what have you, but so much of it is now conducted by electronic means. Do you think there are alternatives? Is this going to drive us back to a face-to-face type of political activism in the same way as education is being pushed towards, face-to-face assessment, that type of, those sorts of issues? Just ramblings.
I mean, a chunk of the other book project I mentioned, which I'm hoping to finish by Christmas, is about the ontology of digital campaigns and the tendency towards fragility of movements that are reliant on assembling and coordinating people through predominantly mediated relationships. So they can lead to huge, enthusiastic, energetic surges of resistance or action, which is not necessarily progressive, because the Capitol riots, for example, are an example of this, where loose networks consolidated into a mass action. But they also fall apart in the face of changing conditions. So in that sense, organizations that have human-to-human capabilities for coordination, I think, are better able to retain their shape and adapt to changing circumstances. And one thing that is constant at the moment is changing circumstances. In terms of digital elites, I mean, this is something that's fascinated me for years. I just finished the terrible Musk autobiography at the moment, which I don't recommend. It's an awful book in many respects, but it is interesting in parts to understand how these people, or get a sense of how these people experience themselves in the world. And there's one telling quote where someone told the autobiographer that he sees himself as above the presidency, which, that's not a surprise, but it's interesting to have someone close to him say that out loud. And they do exercise an influence, but simultaneously, I think we can overstate it, because I would want to think in terms of transnational capitalist class rather than these figureheads, as much as I'm fascinated by these figureheads. And I think we need to see that at a time when the fault lines of politics are shifting. I'm very interested in the kind of new forms of post-left politics, or kind of left-right alliance, kind of red-brown alliances, it was sometimes called historically. And so I think it's a very complex landscape where the kind of plate tectonics of political organization have shifted. Parliamentary politics is undergoing change. There's economic uncertainty. And it was already a terrifying concurrence of forces, something which I think is inherently has the capacity to generate fascism, which I think we are seeing in kind of neo-fascist form. And then you drop generative AI into that. It's not a good thing. So I'm trying to intellectualize it, because it's the only way I can avoid despairing, because it is very interesting, but I am extremely bleak about the future of democracy under these circumstances.
And of course, big tech and generative AI haven't come up against the ultimate power of the state, which of course is military and coercive. And I'll retreat now.
It's interesting, the military. So there was a really interesting intervention by the head of AI for the Department of Defense in the US, saying that there is too much human judgment required to evaluate the outputs of generative AI systems for them to be used in a military situation. So that was reassuring, because the kind of fragility of these systems in a military context is terrifying, because they don't work, and they don't work in entirely unpredictable ways. So that could be a disaster.
Thanks, Alistair, for that very poignant question. Catherine.
Thanks, Roger. Hi, Mark.
Okay.
I've been struggling to formulate this question, so I might just talk you through, just say a few of the things that popped into my head and maybe ask for a response to those. I was really interested in what you said about your ongoing project about agency and technology, I guess. And what I was thinking straight away was about this form of technology being another potential source of an inequality, like a distinction between who has the power to use it, who's controlling how it is used, who has access to the technology to enable them to benefit from it, all of those things. And I guess I was just really interested to hear, if you're happy to speak about it, a little bit more about some of your thoughts on agency in relation to how AI becomes a tool for people to be able to act or not if they don't have access.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about that quite happily all day. So I can definitely talk about it for the last 9 minutes of the session. Yeah, so to start with the case study of academics, I'm arguing that we can see it as an interlocutor. So I'm thinking of interlocutor in Charles Taylor's sense of interactions that elaborate who we are and how we see the world. And what limits generative AI is that it forgets outside of a particular context window. But within, I think it's 70,000 characters effectively, or tokens, which are roughly 70,000 words, we can develop mutual understanding. It can learn what we're asking of it. It can retain information in the conversation. But then at a certain point, it just starts forgetting what we've talked about previously. But I think there is a real relationality that can emerge, albeit a shallow relationality, but I think it is relationality. So I'm doing a project on Maggie Archer's late papers on AI, which at the time I was not sure what to make of them, but now they just seem incredibly prescient to me in retrospect. So these are 3 papers she did, and I guess it was the last kind of major original piece of research where it was a speculative science fiction scenario, and it's analyzing the relationship between an unnamed research scientist and his AI system, Homer, and asking questions about the relationality between them. Do they have a common good? Are they friends? And I think these are very interesting questions to ask. And so we're still quite far from the scenario that she outlined, but within the constraints of the context window, within this computationally defined period where the AI is learning from our interaction, I think there is relationality there. And so with academics, I've argued that this is a particular kind of interlocutor relationship. And like going back to my earlier work, I've suggested that we have the systems of legacy scholarship. We have social media systems of digital scholarship. And I'm suggesting this is a third set of infrastructures to facilitate interlocution. There are a third set of ways in which we can develop ideas and collaborate. And so the question then becomes, for a good academic life, how do we have a balanced ecology of interlocutors that's right for us? So I'm not suggesting that we should abandon having human collaborators and replace them with AIs, because there are things that human collaborators can do, including, for example, telling us to shut up sometimes that AI systems can't. But equally, you can have a conversation with an AI system at 1 a.m. in the morning when you can't sleep, and it will talk to you about something very minute and boring to anyone who's not sharing your project. So, there's all these different ways in which we can relate and collaborate. There's different ways we can relate and collaborate, and I'm interested in the selectivity involved. So what is it to relate well in one of these modes? What is it to relate well for me? So there's a reflexivity involved at all stages of this. So I'm trying to contrast the affordances of the technology, the objective potentials of what we can do with it, but realizing those has to be a reflexive process in which we clarify and then try and achieve a relation to that technology that is good for us in our own terms. And that might change over time. And so that's where I'm going with it. So it's the kind of technological dimension to reflexivity, building on the modes of reflexivity model.
Thank you, Catherine. And I think it's probably time that we might, unless there are any other questions, I think we might close this down for this current session. So on behalf of the Australian Sociological Association, Mark, I'd like to thank you for presenting this morning from Manchester. And I think it was a very thought-provoking and challenging paper that you gave. I think there's plenty for us to think about, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Bye.
Thank you all for attending.